I've been backcountry alone enough times to know the difference between ordinary silence and the kind of quiet that carries intent. Call the place Silver Pine. The old family cabin rests in a hollow of the national forest, a 7-hour haul from my city life, the kind of place you go to hunt and unspool the static in your head. For years, it was my refuge, a modest, wood-sided house with a sagging front deck, rattly windows, and a keypad on the door because my father and I hate fumbling for keys in cold weather. I've probably made the trip 40 times in my life. By 2017, I still went up alone sometimes, but after what happened that trip, I didn't want to go alone again. I pulled the truck off the dirt road and eased it onto the long, unkept grass that serves as our driveway. There's no formal path, just the tired ruts made by decades of pickups and ATVs. The late summer breeze was merciful. Even in the valley heat, there was that cool edge at dusk that always smells like pine and old cordwood. Inside, the cabin felt both familiar and slightly out of use. Mouse traps leaning over in one corner, dust on the windowsill, a chair missing a spindle. I tossed my gear inside, flicked the breakers, and coaxed the water heater back to life. Little rituals like tossing stale mouse carcasses into the trash and airing the place out are maintenance and comfort all at once. Tiny repudiations of wilderness entropy. By the time I had my hunting vest laid out and my Winchester cleaned, the sun was folding itself behind the ridge. That is when I heard it. High, bright peals of laughter from the trees. At first I thought it might be hunters passing on a trail, a group of teenagers maybe, but the sound was too young, lilting like kids playing hide-and-seek around a creek. My back went a little hard with irritation. This was my property. Trespassers on private timber mean trouble, not only because of liability, but because they scare game away. I stepped to the living room window and cranked the heavy sash open to listen. The laughter sounded solid and close, but when I peered into the darkening woods, I saw nothing. I walked out the back door toward the sound, Winchester slung across my shoulder like a calm talisman. The laughter stayed the same distance ahead of me no matter how far I pushed. Step after step, the sound arranged itself like a shadow that preferred to stay just out of reach. At one point, I thought I glimpsed a white flash among trunks. A jacket, a child running. But the trees can play tricks at dusk, and the world was awash of trunks and black hollows. Finally, I gave it a few loud terminal commands. A shotgun blast into the air, more for startling the pranksters than for anything else. And the laughter cut off as if someone had pinched the power switch. That should have been the end of it. The next day I took the High Lookout, a crude wooden tower my dad built years back. The tower overlooks a sweep of valley where deer like to pass. Good vantage, good coffee, and the patient. Deliberate nothing that makes hunting holy. Mid-afternoon, something bright and childish threaded the stillness again. The same laughing, the same impossible cheer. I called my dad and he told me to chase them off if I saw them. So I fired a couple of near misses into the clearing with the same scorched apology of sound. The giggles cut off like someone had hung up a phone. For a while I watched the tree line and felt the smugness of a man who'd done his duty, chased off trespassing kids and saved his hunting season. Night turned cold. the kind of cold that makes the cabin huff and breathe in ways you can feel through the floor. I opened the windows to let air move through the rooms, the screens clattering as the breeze negotiated its way into the house. I was nursing a headache and a quiet soreness from the tower, and sleep felt possible with the windows wide and the land breathing. Then, sometime after 11, the laughter returned. Louder. Closer. It had a quality that it had not possessed before. Not simply voices, but layered, as if a chorus of children were shifted through some electronic lens into a hall of echoes. My skin tightened. I grabbed a flashlight and my Winchester, and this time I went out with purpose. The laughter swelled, no longer a teasing faraway thing, but a wall of sound that seemed to sit 20 meters away, just on the edge of the pool of my light. I scolded them in a voice I hoped would sell menace and authority, a single man shouting into a dark tree line. Then something thudded beside my boot. An object landed like a blunt punctuation in the grass. I looked down and saw a cheap, battered speaker. It had been placed so the recorded laughter blasted out into the clearing, an electronic mask for whatever lived out there. I picked the thing up and heaved it back into the trees without thinking. There, beyond the spill of my flashlight beam, something crossed the edge of the circle. A figure, human but oddly still, the silhouette sliding between trunks like a practiced animal. For the first time in the night, I felt a raw, animal hollow where my blood collects. I fired one round into the air. A warning, the kind of sound meant to slice fear into the world, and yelled threats about what would happen if anyone came closer. I wasn't there to kill. I wanted them gone. I ran back inside, slammed the door, and bolted the keypad with shaking hands. I closed every curtain and told myself I was being rational. Call the sheriff. Wait them out. Don't sleep with the windows open. Then I saw it. A smear on the living room window, in the lower corner, too dark to be condensation. I angled the torch, and the smear glistened with a viscous, dark splattered sheen. For a breath I couldn't read it. Then the instinct to not look too long made me rip the curtain back a sliver. Words were scored there, crimson and crude. A message written across the glass and something that had run in streaks. I didn't give it time. I stuffed a bag, threw the Winchester in without thinking of leaving it, and for the first time since I'd been a small boy, I felt the clean, cold steer of pure flight. I locked the keypad as if locking life itself, jumped into the truck, and drove away before the engine's warm-up chimes finished. On the road, lights smeared the night into a watercolor of pine and peak. I called my dad while heading back toward civilization and heard the brief, flat relief in his voice. "Go now," he said. "Don't risk it." That night I slept in the fluorescent safety of a motel, the cabin and the smeared words behind me like a wound I couldn't yet name. In the morning we would go back, but even as the road took me down the mountain, the laughter lingered in my ears, stubborn and wrong, like a loop of someone's attempt to make joy into menace. Morning came up the mountain like someone pulling a thin sheet across a bruise, hesitant, pale, and revealing things you didn't want to see. I stayed in a motel that night because staying in that house felt like knotting at a guillotine. Sleep came in fits, punctuated by the small, involuntary flashes of the recorded laughter, that cheap speaker landing like a punctuation mark in the grass, and the red smear on the window that had the awful clarity of someone else's script across my life. By the time my truck wound back up the dirt road, the valley smelled like wet earth and juniper. My father was already there, boots making a steady clockwise of sound on the porch, as if he'd been walking it in circles to keep his hands useful. He didn't look surprised when I told him what happened. He listened the way men listen when they've learned the difference between a bluster and alarm. Nodding, arms folded, mouth working around the syllables he preferred not to say. We went through the motions. He checked the locks. I showed him the smear on the glass that had looked like blood. He touched the pane with a gloved finger and then frowned. The crimson was gone, wiped clean in a way that made the edges of my stomach ache. Whoever had been there had taken care to leave an image, and then, perhaps later, to remove the mean proof of their message. That action felt personal and deliberate, the sort of small cruelty that isn't about vandalism so much as theater. We split the cabin into zones and searched like two soldiers clearing a house. The bedrooms, the kitchen, the pantry. My flashlight scoured the corners. Old hunting trophies glowed in the sweep like indifferent witnesses. The closet where my gear lived was undisturbed, the windows all latched. My father pried the baseboards where mice had chewed once and checked the attic route for any sign of a visitor. We found nothing dramatic, no forced entries, no overturned furniture, no small hands left behind. That made me angrier than a break-in would have. A break is honest. This felt like a thing designed to be felt and not seen, a performance staged for maximum dread and minimum legal consequence. He walked the perimeter with me, boots sinking into the damp grass where the speaker had landed. The impression it left was more like a bruise in the lawn than a footprint. No intruder track that we could follow into the tree line. The speaker itself was gone, as if someone had thought better of being crude about it, or had retrieved it in the dark after they'd finished their message. If I hadn't found it, I would have called it a weird hallucination. Finding the object and then finding it had evaporated made the whole thing feel contrived and cruel, and that cruelty lodged like a pebble behind my ribs. We stayed the day and combed the edge of the woods with care, calling out in voices that were part bravado and part stupid hope that someone would answer, and we could yell and end the weirdness in a fist fight. The trees only answered with their ordinary sounds: wind through needles, a woodpecker ticking on distant bark, and the occasional distant caw of a raven that made the hair on my arms rise. My father kept circling back to the practical. He wanted better locks, a sturdier latch, and for me not to bolt the house at the first odd thing, but to sleep there with the doors closed and a radio on so someone couldn't get the idea they were unseen. His voice tried to trade fear for sense. It worked in one sense. Actions quieted the raw edges of panic, but they couldn't erase the image the laughter had tattooed across the back of my skull. At dusk, the sense of being watched thickened like fog. I sat on the porch with a thermos and watched the sun shrug off the ridgeline, thinking about how something had used the sound of joy, the sound of children, as a mask. That thought wouldn't leave me alone. Children's laughter made into mechanical playback as a means to lure and disorient. The pure, defiant noise of youth perverted into a lure. It was obscene in some way that pressed at my throat. I tried to imagine the person behind it, teenager with a prankster's cruel streak, a local kid with a taste for shocks, or something weirder, someone who knew how people reacted to certain sounds. The possibilities multiplied, and every one of them left a bitter tang. That night I didn't sleep in the cabin. We drove down to the nearest town and took a motel with fluorescent lights so bright they made the shadows retreat politely. My father stayed up late, drinking coffee and tapping his cigarette against the ashtray like he was doing arithmetic with the problem of bravery. At 2 a.m. he told me, flat and tired, that we would go back at first light and sweep again. That he would bring a camera and some of the traps he used when he did trail cams for game. He wanted to set things up. A heat sensor, a recorded playback of human chatter, something to turn the tables and make whoever it was aware they were being watched. We returned at dawn like people expecting the worst and hoping for evidence. The camera and sensor were cheap and honest. Black boxes mounted under the eaves and aimed toward the clearing. We left one on a tripod at the spot the speaker had landed, covered and ready to be tripped. For hours nothing happened. The forest gave us noon sun and the boring chorus of insects. My father made a joke to loosen our shoulders, and for a moment, absurdly, it worked. We laughed about tracks and about how cautious you'd become when a chunk of your life got rearranged by an anonymous cruelty. After sunset, though, the woods decided to remind us it had other plans. The speaker never returned. The blood on the pane had been cleaned by someone who wanted to remove the explicit evidence while leaving the implicit terror intact. That fact felt like a signature. Someone who wanted a message recognized but not cataloged. The sensors, however, did pick up a series of blips that night, a small, moving heat source at the tree line that phased in and out like something wearing an insulator or a shadow with pockets of warm air. We watched the live feed with the quiet fury of people watching someone rummage in their home. The image was grainy, a smear that could be dismissed as a rabbit or a fox if you were an optimist. But the shape paused in the fringe, as if listening, and for a beat it felt like it had tilted its head toward the cabin where we sat and watched it fidget. I swear in the dark to this day, there was a moment when the feed showed a dim, upright shape at the tree line that matched nothing natural. It was not a human silhouette proper, too long, too deliberate, and yet something in its motion was patient, deliberate as a hunter deciding whether to spring. We didn't wait to find out. The shape melted into the trees as if it had been pulled by a string. We packed up the gear and drove the long road down the mountain again that night, my hands white on the wheel. My father's voice, a low, steady instrument in the passenger seat, insisting it was all traceable, that the evidence would speak eventually. Back in the city I slept badly, with the cheap, steady confidence that people paying attention is better than the alternate. My father stayed up that night and called me 3 times, each check an ordinary ritual, until the mountain's distance felt like a thin line on the map. He told me over the phone that the scratches on the window frame were not random. They suggested a tool, and a person practiced at small handiwork. He said something that landed soft and terrible. Sometimes you don't know what targeted you. You only know you're wearing eyes now. The laughter in the back of my head became a loop I couldn't unhear. Bright, shrill, and triumphant in the way anger sometimes is when it wants to be cruel. I started to imagine the house as a stage set used to teach patience. Whoever did it had thought about how people respond to certain noises, how they rush to investigate, how the night amplifies fear, That planning felt monstrous because it required time and empathy twisted into malice. I stopped going up alone after that. I wasn't brave enough to trust the woods with a voicemail from a stranger, or the bright innocence of children's laughter turned into a weapon. The forest had become not a cathedral, but a theater, where someone practiced in the dark and learned how easily humans would answer a call to play. We tried to outthink whatever had visited the cabin, and in trying, I learned a few hard rules about fear. It loves routines, it studies small habits, and it retreats when visible light and a noisy crowd strip its theater bare. After we hauled the gear down the mountain that second time, I told myself the sensors and the camera footage would be the end of it. That was the useful lie people tell themselves to sleep. The camera never gave us a clear face, only blobs, jumps of heat, the occasional animal silhouette. But it did reveal something worse in outline. Someone learning the edge of the property, lingering long enough to map approaches, testing the timing of our comings and goings, like a carpenter checking a door's swing. Months passed and the immediate terror cooled into a more manageable, vigilant memory. I stopped going up alone. I stopped leaving the bedroom windows open at night. Instead of solo escapes, I invited company, friends with camping gear who laughed too loudly, my father who brought his slow, practical calm, and once a cousin who taught me to string a snare properly and to trust how a trap talks when it's been tripped. The cabin became a place that smelled of coffee and oil again, of animal fur drying by the stove, of the small human rituals that undo dread, shared meals, lights left on, footsteps that were not mine. Those things mattered more than the cameras. Even so, the sound of laughter haunted the gaps between ordinary noises. In the middle of a clear morning, I might suddenly pick at the air, half hearing an old loop of children screaming with unalloyed joy, and my throat would seize. Nights were worse. The way wind catches a hollow log and makes it sing would, for a second, fold into the timbre of that recorded mirth, and my limbs would want to move before my mind could say why. The best defense turned out to be banal. Keep the curtains closed, keep the lights timed, keep a radio on low. The worst defense was over-familiarity, telling yourself it's safe, and then being surprised when it's not. One autumn, a rumor started in the small community that hugged the forest roads. Someone had found a stash of old speakers near an abandoned hunting camp 20 minutes down Ridge Hollow. They were cheap, waterlogged, the kind you buy at a pawn shop, and one still had a recording on it, static, then laughter, looped and thin. A neighbor dropped the speaker off at my place, embarrassed and strange-eyed. We set it on the porch like a relic you don't quite want to touch. Hearing it played back in daylight changed nothing about the mechanical cruelty of that sound. It was still the same bright, hollow laugh, but it stripped the encounter of some of its theater. In daylight, the laugh was a thing with wires and a dented case. At midnight, it had been a wall of living noise that could drown a man's sense of place. There were explanations offered in the small, practical conclaves of hunters and foresters. A bored teenager with a taste for pranks. A local who'd made a macabre hobby of unsettling city visitors. Someone with a grudge against the owners of the cabin for reasons no one could remember. None fit perfectly, and the gaps between suspicion and proof are where paranoia feeds. But the community's attention made the person behind the plan less confident. We made the place less private. That worked in its blunt way. Years later, the worst thing about the incident isn't that a stranger borrowed the voice of children and used it like a lure. The worst thing is the lesson it insisted on teaching, that some people are practiced at turning everyday sounds into alarms, and that the smallest domestic habits, leaving a window open, parking a truck with the lights off, can be invitations if someone is patient enough. The memory is not a single dramatic scene, so much as a series of smaller, sharper images. The cheap speaker landing with a dull plop in the grass. The smear on the glass that had me thinking of blood, even though my rational mind begged for a less monstrous origin. The silhouette that paused at the tree line and then slid away like a shadow being pulled back through a keyhole. There were nights I rode the highway home and rehearsed how I would confront the thing if I'd stayed, aimed a beam until the creature was sick of being held, forced it to show hands and face, laid a trap with the hunters. Patience. Those are hero fantasies. Effective in small doses because they give you back a sense of agency. Real courage, I found, was more pedestrian. It was in the chores my father insisted on, in the camera's unreliable watchfulness, in a neighbor offering a coffee and an honest ear, in teaching someone to identify the ordinary sounds from the ones that try to pretend to be ordinary. Sometimes I think about the person who set the whole performance in motion. Were they bored, cruel, practicing some dark curiosity? The question gnaws like a gnawed bone because the answer matters less than the pattern. Whoever did it had taken time to study how a man in the woods would react to a child's laugh. That knowledge is what unsettles me most, because it presumes a certain intimacy with human reflexes. It presumes an intention to frighten for the thrill of seeing fear bloom. The final image that follows me now, when I let memory unspool, is simple and stubborn. The porch at dusk with a line of cheap speakers on the step like mute sentries, the camera's red LED blink beneath the eaves, and my father's boots on the deck boards as he lifts the thermos and says, in a voice rough with worry that has become the household's anchor, "We're not letting this be a private thing." It's not cinematic vengeance. It's neighborliness and preparedness, light where there was darkness and company where solitude once reigned. That is the small, humane end to a story that could have been something much colder. It taught me that the best answer to a patient, cruel voyeur is not steel alone, but company, noise, and the steady light of others who will not look away.